Good evening, everyone. My name is John Horning, and I'm the Executive Director of WildEarth Guardians. We've got Guardian supporters from all over the country taking part of this call. Most of you are here in the West, but I know we've got people on both coasts and scattered everywhere in between. Earlier today, I got an email from a woman who's a member from Ireland, and she said she was going to try and stay up till midnight to join us, and I encouraged her to do so. So it's great to know that we've got Guardian supporters not only all over the country, but all over the world as well. And, one of the things about the pandemic is that it's, even as we are hopefully coming to a full close on it, is that it has separated us. And but one of the silver linings is that we've adapted and have these virtual forums now that have become kind of just a part of how we do things, and they do allow for connection, and I'm grateful for that. In these webinars, we like to bring together all kinds of different folks, experts, people from frontline communities, elected officials even, and oftentimes WildEarth Guardian staff. We always like to talk about critical issues at critical times. And our purpose, as always, is to inform, to inspire, and to activate Guardians all over the country, all over the world. And really the purpose is to help create the kind of world we want. And that's not easy given these political times, and it only happens when people band together in a spirited way and a focused way to get good things done. We love to take questions, so know that if you give us questions in the chat bar, in the chat box, we will both do a question or two at about the half hour, and then I'll take as many as I can at the end. Today, we are talking with John Leshy, who is one of our nation's foremost experts on public lands law and policy. John recently finished his latest book. I love the title. It's a phrase I've used, actually. Our Common Ground, a history of America's public lands. And really looking forward to this conversation. John's currently an emeritus law professor at the University of California, Hastings College of Law in San Francisco. I wrote this, I'm not sure that it's the case, but I imagine that it is, that one of John's highlights was his 8 years working for Secretary Bruce Babbitt at the Interior Department as the solicitor. As I said, I'm looking forward to this conversation because I have long admired John, and as a student of history myself, my connection to public lands is one that comes through the history lens. So welcome, John. It's good to have you.
Thank you very much, John. I'm delighted to be here, and really appreciate the opportunity to talk about public lands, one of our favorite subjects.
So great. I thought I'd start with it. Why this book at this time? What motivated you to write it?
Well, I spent practically a half a century working on public lands issues inside and outside of government. And over that time, I've had a chance to talk to many people about public lands. And Kevin, if you would put up the map, just so we can have a quick look at what we're talking about. And you tell people, gee, isn't it amazing that in a country that sort of distrusts government, particularly the national government, and also respects private property and private action, that almost 1/3 of the land in the United States is owned and managed by the national government for these very broad public purposes, primarily conservation. And you tell people that, and they say, my gosh, isn't that amazing? How did that happen? And so I wrote this book to really tell the story of how it happened, how the public lands that we see and enjoy today, which cover more than 600 million acres of land in the United States, how that came about. And it's a political history because it came about through political decision making. And so that's the core of my book. It's the political history of the public lands. What were the political decisions that led to the public lands we see today? And in the course of writing it and spending years in some pretty deep research on that history, I uncovered some things that were surprising to me, even though I'd worked in this area a long time. One of the surprising things, which is contrary to the sort of myth that exists out there, is that this was not a federal land grab over the opposition of state and local communities. This was something that was done in almost every case with not only the consent, but the support and the petitioning and the grassroots activism that led to this. This is something that people wanted at the local level as well as the national level. And another surprising thing is that it was bipartisan, almost always. This was not an issue on which Republicans and Democrats disagreed. And this is a consistent trend for more than a century. And it's very much at odds with how people think today. You know, we all think in red and blue terms, and you're for or against. And that's not how the history of public lands evolved. So I thought those were important things to uncover and explain for people, because I think it is our common ground, and it came about because we wanted it to come about. So that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah. You mentioned being surprised. I'm curious if there was actually quite a wide consensus and bipartisanship around the policy of retention. We'll get into that, of retaining these lands as opposed to kind of piecemeal selling them off. I'm curious if there was an anecdote, a particular story that was particularly illuminating in terms of that surprise. And this wasn't a question that I had prepared, but as I'm listening to you, it's like, was it really surprising? And was there a story from a particular politician or state where that manifested that this really was quite a lot of consensus around the retention and celebration even of public lands?
Well, I'll give you one small story of many in the book, actually. But one of the pivotal moments, the core of my book really starts around 1890, because it was in 1891 that Congress gave the president broad power to hold on to, reserve was the term in the law, to reserve public lands, put them off limits to sale, to transfer, to grants, to homesteading, etc. And that was a very, very big moment. And the president immediately started exercising that power. And over the next 20 years, Republican and Democratic presidents alike used that power to create what is today the National Forest System, almost 200 million acres of land. Now, when they did that, and today, or part of the myth is Theodore Roosevelt did it all, right? Well, Theodore Roosevelt came along sort of late in that process. The process started 11 years before he became president. And President Benjamin Harrison was in office when that law passed. And President Harrison, when that law passed, almost immediately exercised it to reserve a million acres around Yellowstone National Park. And then he did something, and this is the story. He picked a retiring congressman from Montana to be in charge of implementing this law, to make recommendations to the president, to be head of what was then called the General Land Office. And this retiring congressman named Thomas Carter, who was very ambitious and went on to become a two-term senator from Montana, he took over the General Land Office, and he started recommending to the president reserving all of the lands in the upper reaches, the public lands in the upper reaches of the Western watersheds. So again, not a federal land grab. This was a local guy who had ambitions, political ambitions in Montana, and he set that process in motion. And over the next 20 years, Harrison and Cleveland and McKinley and then Theodore Roosevelt basically used that power to create the National Forest System, almost always in response to petitions from local grassroots citizen activists.
That's remarkable. Thomas Carter.
Nobody ever heard of him, right?
I pride myself on knowing names in the history of public lands, but I did not know that name, and I think it is quite remarkable that, was Harrison was on the conservative flank of the political spectrum?
Well, Harrison was from
him?
Ohio.
Yeah.
Ohio. He was a Civil War veteran, which is another interesting point. Most of the people involved in that era were Civil War veterans on both sides. Okay, there were former Confederates and former Union. And so one of the themes I develop in the book is the idea that reserving and conserving these public lands was in part a healing process after the horrible Civil War period. And so another very small anecdote, but Yellowstone National Park was set aside in 1872. And then there were railroads and speculators and the miners and others wanted to dismember the park. And two people came together to basically preserve Yellowstone as we know it today. One was Phil Sheridan, Civil War general, and the other was a senator from Missouri who had served in the Confederate cabinet in the Civil War. So they had been enemies, historic enemies, and they came together to basically protect Yellowstone Park for all to enjoy as we see it today. And last August, 1 million people visited Yellowstone National Park. First time in the history that broke all records.
In the month of August.
In the month of August. One month, yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. Sheridan's got quite a complicated legacy when you think about it.
He does. Because he helped dispossess the Native Americans from lands. And there's a suggestion, which I found in the historical research, that one of the reasons Sheridan was so interested in preserving Yellowstone and setting aside more lands was kind of to expiate that sin. That was maybe part of his motivation. Yeah. And I should emphasize that my book, the core of my book, as I said, begins around 1890. And that was after, usually well after, I mean, decades and hundreds of years after the Native Americans were dispossessed. And so it wasn't that the United States decided to grab these lands from the Native Americans to preserve and conserve them. It was that the United States got these lands from the Native Americans with an awful lot of, bad, dishonorable dealings. Yep. But nevertheless, they had clear title and were giving it away. And then they decided to start keeping some of it. So that's an important sequence. And many people, there are good books out there about the tragic treatment of Native Americans and land. That's not my story. My story is how did the United States, once they got the lands, decide to hold on to and conserve them? And I do have a chapter toward the end of my book, which talks at some length about the modern efforts since the sort of rebirth and revitalization of Native American sovereignty, how they have exercised a lot of effort to influence how these lands are managed, and in some cases to get some of them back. And we can talk about that later. Yeah, but I do deal with that toward the end of my book.
Yeah, we will talk about that more later in our conversation. You've mentioned this period of time, kind of in the early, kind of mid 1890s, as a critical time in which Western leaders were advocating for retention and protection, primarily through the creation and designation of national forests. Was there another one or two critical moments in, I can think of 1976 and Flip Mob, but were there other moments when there was a flush of political will and popular support for this retention policy, key moments?
Well, the remarkable thing about the story to me is that once the ball started rolling in 1890, 1891, 1890, Congress created 3 new national parks in California, the first big national park since Yellowstone. And then 1891, they passed this authority for the president to reserve what became the National Forest System. Once that ball started rolling, it continued on at a fairly regular pace. And so it wasn't jagged. It was a pretty continuous process that involved a number of different things. I should emphasize, my book is really the first book in a very long time that has talked about all the public lands together. So, there are a lot of good histories of the national parks and the Forest Service and that sort of thing. I deal with all the lands. I deal with lands managed by the Forest Service, the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Land Management. all together. Once that ball started rolling, then you had things like, for example, 1906, Congress passed the Antiquities Act, which gave the president very broad power to set aside lands that contained objects of historic or scientific interest. That was the key phrase in the bill.
1906.
1906. And
Yep.
presidents, Republican and Democratic presidents ever since, have used the Antiquities Act power to set aside more than 100 million acres and conserve them onshore, and then actually several hundred millions of acres offshore. This is, again, bipartisan exercise. Congress has never seriously interfered with that action, and has usually actually come along and gotten some credit for it by putting its own label on these lands. So, for example, I just discovered the other day, I think almost one half of the 63 national parks we have, the big iconic national parks, started out being protected by presidents under the Antiquities Act. So it's a good example of, the president setting the ball in motion, and then Congress coming along and claiming some of the credit by putting the park label on these things. Then you had wildlife refuges started to be created in the early 20th century. You had, in 1911, Congress passing a very significant law, which was really the first environmental rehabilitation law in the nation's history, which was to purchase up mostly logged over lands in the New England and the South and the Midwest, purchased from willing sellers with local and state and local consent, to put them into the national forest system and to rehabilitate them, to reforest them. That was 1911. Then you had a kind of a push to create many wildlife refuges in the middle part of the country to protect migratory birds. That was in the 1920s and the 1930s. And then you had the Taylor Grazing Act in the 1930s that essentially led to the reservation of the lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management today. Yep. And on and on. So it was a pretty continuous process involving lots of different steps from 1890 on.
It's remarkable. I want to return to one thing that you said a few minutes ago, which is really having me reflect, which is that part of the support for public lands came out of what I would rephrase as the trauma of war. And that for whatever reason, and maybe it was that natural spaces provide solace for a nation and for individuals trying to heal from the trauma of war, and thinking about, to this day, how retired veterans are critical advocates for wild spaces in their own healing journey. And I'm wanting to tie a thread here, which is, and you noted it in remarking about the 1 million people that visited Yellowstone last year in 1 month in August, but that as the nation experienced the trauma of the pandemic,
exactly,
that it created a yearning for connection with the natural world. And so I hadn't tied those two or been aware of the deeper history of the military's support for wild spaces as solace for damaged souls. Curious to just hear your reflections on that.
Yeah, well, I think it's an excellent point. I mean, I go back to the core meaning of the word recreation is recreate, is, to find yourself, to be reborn, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, it's no surprise that in the pandemic and in the aftermath of the pandemic, I mean, the public lands were flooded with users, recreational users of all kinds. And, it's a challenge, it's a problem, but it's a nice problem in the sense that we don't want to close these lands down. We don't want to, deny access, et cetera. But we also have to figure out how to manage these, so to preserve the experiences that bring people there in the first place. And so that is a genuine theme running through public land protection. And there's another trauma, not war, but the Great Depression was another time when people actually, when public land policy went through some really fundamental changes in the direction of protecting more and more lands as a reaction to the Great Depression. So those are important factors.
Speak to one example of that. I mean, I know the Taylor Grazing Act was in the midst of the Great Depression, but that's quite an interesting fact that as the country is suffering through economic angst, it reaches for greater protections. What would be one example of that thread?
Well, I mean, in the 1930s, for example, the Eastern National Forests expanded. Franklin Roosevelt placed a big emphasis on that. There were also millions of acres of in the arid West of failed homesteads. You know, where people had tried to make a agricultural living under the Homestead Act, but the land just couldn't support it. It was too arid. Well, the United States had a major program started in the New Deal to buy those lands back and restore them. And so we have now, I don't know, it's 15 million or more acres of national grasslands scattered around various Western states. So that's another example of the New Deal at work here. It was also the first time in the New Deal where the idea of so-called wilderness protection, or, you know, really protecting lands from road building as well as industrial activity and stuff, that idea began to take hold in the 1930s as well.
Wow. Interesting. You've mentioned 1872 in Yellowstone. Most people, at least on this webinar, of course, know about Yellowstone. Most people, I think, could name the date, 1872, as a significant date. It's also the date of another important law that you know very well. I actually have, not on this bookshelf over here, but at home, your book on the general mining law. So just speak to briefly that law, what it stands for, and just how it speaks to the complexity of our nation's relationship to public lands. Because as much as this conversation is about retention and protection, there is another whole narrative around extraction and exploitation. And the year 1872, I think, captures that beautifully, if a little painfully, if you know, for those of you who know the 1872 mining law.
Well, yeah, I think it was 10 days ago was the 150th anniversary of President Ulysses Grant signing the 1872 mining law into law. So it's been around 150 years. And it is really the last relic of that period that's still on the books. I mean, the last relic of the sort of giveaway era. And how it survived is, you know, it's remarkable, but I mean, there is a good political explanation for it, why it survived, because of the power of the mining industry, in part to sell the image of the lone prospector out there with the burrow and the pickaxe, you know, which is not what the mining industry has been like since even before the 1872 mining law was passed, because when the Comstock lode was discovered in Nevada in 1859, hard rock mining converted into a big industry, basically into a wage industry. So the 1872 mining law was sort of designed for an industry that never actually really had long since ended, but it's still there, and it's as I've been fond of saying, I think the public lands of the United States are the only piece of ground on the earth, on the planet, where you can mine and not pay the owner of that land any money. Because if you're on private land, or if you're in any other country in the world, or if you're on state land, you pay the owner of the land a rental and or a royalty for the privilege of extracting the minerals, but not on the US public land. And so it is an amazing relic. And there have been many efforts, and I've been involved in quite a few over the years to change it. And the law has changed. I will admit, you know, you don't have completely free reign. The government does regulate to some extent the operations of the mining companies that extract these hard rock minerals, but they still pay nothing. And it is a relic, and the law should be modernized or replaced.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples of the law not only serving the industry in ridiculous ways, but being deployed by others in ways that I'm thinking about, the way in which developers would, I remember from 20 years ago, a guy who would identify sort of pseudo half-baked mining claims on in-holdings within wilderness and use those development schemes to hold the federal agency and conservation groups hostage. And so it is both remarkable that it exists and remarkable that it's not, in its fundamental essence, not been reformed, even as you said, the agencies have discretion. I want to just say one thing, which is, would love one or two questions from our audience. I haven't seen any yet, but if anyone wants to ask a question of John, know that I'll put it out there. Was there anything else that you wanted to say just about the 1872 mining law?
Well, one of the champions for modernizing the law is your own Senator Heinrich there in New Mexico, and I do want to give a shout out to him because he's trying to do the right thing here, and I hope he gets support for it over the next Congress or two.
Yeah, Heinrich is great. We're lucky to have him here in New Mexico. The West is lucky to have someone like him. Our nation is lucky to have someone like him, and it will be interesting to see if that effort can get through the gridlock of Congress, because on all these issues, when you've got a Western Republican who's on the opposite end of the political spectrum, it does make even modest compromise really quite challenging. But at least Harry Reid, who blocked all efforts at reform because of the gold mining industry in Nevada, he's no longer the broker for the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, because as long as he was, things weren't going anywhere. Maybe this is an opportunity for me to ask one question about optimism. And the book and you seem to strike a tone of optimism. And I see that in the long arc, and even in the last 10 years, there are examples of Trump supporting public land conservation measures, both publicly and by virtue of just signing bills that Congress did the heavy lifting on. But in today's environment, I wonder if you could speak more about why you feel optimistic, not in the micro, because there are moments where the prognostication is, well, things aren't going to move, but more in the slightly more macro understanding of this broader movement of conservation of these great lands.
Yes, well, as I said earlier, if you start in 1890 and look at the arc of public land policy, it is always constantly moving toward holding on to and protecting more and more lands. And it's pretty unbroken. It doesn't go up and down. It is in one direction across all administrations, regardless of political party. And there have been a few little hiccups along the way, but it's remarkably consistent. And Trump, you could say, well, yes, he downsized those two large Utah monuments, but he also signed into law bills that protected millions of acres of wilderness. And the 2020 Great American Outdoors Act has been called the most significant public lands legislation in a generation, because it makes more and more money available to buy and better protect the lands that we have, buy more lands and hold them. So that arc is quite consistent. And if you look at that arc, you have to say to yourself, there is definitely room to be optimistic here. Now, having said that, the country's terribly polarized, and there is a segment of the polity that likes to do the sort of dog whistle about land grab, and we need to turn these lands over to the states or to private interests or whatever. But if you look at the opinion polls in every state, including every Western state, over the last many years, Republicans and Democrats say we like these lands being held onto in national ownership, and we like them protected, and we should do more of it. And so public opinion has really been quite consistent. And we can only hope that the politicians, keep listening to them.
Yep.
And following that. So that does make me generally optimistic. I mean, there are plenty of things to be concerned about, big challenges.
Yeah.
Climate change being certainly maybe the major one, but I do remain optimistic.
Good. Well, I'm an optimist. To me, optimism is both a blessing and a curse. For me, it's a bit of a birthright. I was born with it, so I can't help but be optimistic. And someone once said, I'm optimistic in spite of the facts. And,
yeah, right. Yeah.
So, but I actually think that, and reflecting back on the point about trauma and loss and a desire for connection, that I agree with you that having these lands and the broad base of public support for them is undeniable and irrefutable, and potentially, at least for some, politically perilous if they ignore that, if elected officials ignore that. So let's hope that continues to be the case, and that it continues to create, at least in the broader arc of history, a mandate to protect these lands. So we got a question. This one's from Stephanie Myers. And we've got a lot of wildlife advocates at Guardians in our membership base. She says, can you speak about wildlife on these public lands? Why is hunting allowed on wildlife refuges?
Well, I talk about that a little in my book. In part, the emphasis on wildlife as a component of public land management really began around the turn of the 20th century. And it was a reaction to the extinction of the passenger pigeon, which was then well underway, and the near extinction of the bison. So people began to, the American people in general began to say, we don't want this to continue to happen. We want to protect some of these species. And among the leaders of that early movement to use public lands to protect wildlife were hunters. Theodore Roosevelt being the most prominent, and it was quite a remarkable story in a way, because Roosevelt, certainly had his flaws, and he loved to hunt, but he also understood the importance of protecting habitat, and so to him they were part of the same deal, and there was a certain elitism to that. It was the sort of wealthy sport hunters who were in part leading that charge. But they actually, one of the interesting things I uncovered in my research was that the sport hunters also understood that for it to work, they couldn't hunt everywhere. And so they actually supported creating enclaves without hunting in order to sort of sustain their sport in other ways. And they were also willing to pay. So the whole idea, which this came about in the early 30s, this was the Depression era, was the duck stamp idea. The idea that you had to buy a federal duck stamp to hunt migratory birds, and the money went into buying and protecting more habitat. And that was a part of the arrangement that led to all the wildlife refuges in the middle part of the country, and many in other parts of the country were actually acquired through these revenues paid for by sport hunters. And but part of that deal was to protect, to keep some of the wildlife refuges open for hunting. So that's why you can hunt on some refuges, even though it does seem to be a kind of a misnomer to call it a wildlife refuge and say that you can engage in hunting on it. But that was part of the deal where the sportsmen said, we will support acquiring more habitat, et cetera, with our license fees and our hunting fees, but we want to have some of them held open for hunting. Yeah. Now, you can't hunt in national parks. That's a long tradition. You can hunt in certain parts of the national park system, the so-called park preserves. And that was a similar deal, actually, politically, because I go through these political deals in my book. This is really the core of the story. In Alaska, for example, it became, when Congress was debating the landmark Alaska Lands Bill in 1980, which protected more than 100 million acres in Alaska. I mean, it's done on a scale that will never be done again. Yeah. There was a moment in the negotiations over that bill where the question was, are we going to set aside tens of millions of acres? Are we going to put that all in parks? And if we do, because of the long tradition of no hunting in parks, we're going to exclude the hunters? Or are we going to create a new label to put those lands in the park system, but allow hunting? And that was the compromise. The compromise was, okay, we're going to create a new category called park preserves that are, most cases, going to be adjacent to the iconic parks, but they're going to be part of the park system, but they're going to be preserves. And preserves mean that you can actually hunt them. And so that's another example of the sort of political compromises that are sometimes necessary in order to achieve long-term protection. And I think, frankly, that system's worked pretty well.
Yep. There's lots that I want to follow up on there, but I want to move on. And I will get to a couple questions from our audience, but I want to get to 4 big questions, if we can, that I have around kind of the future and thinking about public land culture and law and policy. And the first one has to do with grazing, which is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. I cut my teeth as a young activist at the National Wildlife Federation with a woman by the name of Kathy Carlson and Dave Albersworth, who I know you know both.
I saw Kathy last week, actually, or a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, cool. Yeah. She was my first real mentor and boss. Yeah. And I started in the grazing program, or the BLM program, at the National Wildlife Federation. And as many of our audience know, grazing's one of the most, not one of the most, it's the most ubiquitous use of public lands, perhaps other than maybe recreation is more ubiquitous. And I know that you were a part of one of Babbitt's first and perhaps most controversial initiatives. It was rangeland reform. This was 92, I think, if I'm recalling my dates. I was in DC at the time. I'm curious what you learned about that experience and how that informs your thinking about kind of how we go about addressing both the ecological problems of grazing on public lands and what I would say is the negative political influence of the livestock industry.
Yeah, it is a big part, an important part of the public land story, and I deal with it at some length in my book. You're right. The livestock grazing is acre for acre the most ubiquitous, I would say, extractive use of, or the industrial commercial use of federal lands. 260 or 70 million acres in total, almost half of the total amount, subject to livestock grazing. There's some. I am not a person who says we should get rid of all livestock on public lands. I think there are places, more well-watered places, where historically livestock grazing is perfectly appropriate and not particularly environmentally destructive, where it's sort of mimicking in some respects the bison or other, ancestral animals that used to do something similar. But there are, at the same time, in my mind, clearly some areas where livestock grazing should have never been allowed and is destructive. It's really the hotter deserts of the American West where it can be a problem because livestock tend to concentrate in the riparian areas, and that's where the biodiversity is, and cause erosion and all kinds of water quality and other problems. Now, one of the things that I've worked on, and I know Guardians has worked on for years, is this idea of solving that problem through voluntary transactions, through buyouts, where it's the case actually that often the most troublesome to manage grazing allotments are the ones that cause the most environmental destruction and are the ones that are sort of the least profitable. So it's not uncommon, and as John well knows, to have a situation where a livestock operator says, I've had enough, or my children aren't going to come back, and I want to cash out, or I want to cash out this allotment. I want to retire that area. And it sounds like a perfectly win-win situation to say, well, let's buy them out and retire the land from grazing. But as you well know, John, it's much harder to do in practice than it is in theory. And I think I've long felt this way, that we have to create a better, well-established mechanism for that permanent retirement when you have those voluntary sales and buyouts. And here again, actually, Senator Heinrich has been interested in pursuing that issue. And I think that if more can be done in that area, it could have a big effect, because I think there's quite a lot of money from government and philanthropy to do those kinds of voluntary buyouts. So the livestock operator goes away happy because he or she is cashed out, and the environment does better if the lands are permanently retired. So that's a real opportunity that should be pursued more vigorously. And it's really a problem of just fixing the law, tweaking the law to allow that to happen.
Yep. And briefly, and I have the answer to this, but I'd love to hear it from you. Why law, and why not an administrative process and decision of retiring the permits?
Well, if you're a philanthropist who wants to put money into this, you want to have security, right? I mean, you want to know if you're going to buy the rancher out and turn the permits back to the government, that the government is going to say, okay, we're not going to give those grazing permits to somebody else. And that's what you need, and you can't get under current law unless Congress specifically says, if it's the permits are relinquished, the land shall be permanently retired. That's all it needs to say. Yep. But that provides the security that is necessary. And we've had some unfortunate situations where there were voluntary buyouts of livestock operators in the Grand Staircase National Monument in Utah. And then the Trump administration comes along and undoes the deal and opens the lands up for grazing again after there had been this administrative retirement. So you need legislated retirement in order for it to be secure and for this to really work on a significant scale. And like I said, we're not talking about getting rid of livestock operations on federal lands. We are talking about solving the really most significant environmental problems through these voluntary exchanges of money and permits and then retirement.
Yep. I couldn't agree with you more, as you well know. And I love when we talked about this a year ago, you mentioned this quote, and I don't need you to comment on it, but you said pound for pound, acre for acre, and dollar for dollar, there's no more valuable conservation strategy in the American West than grazing permit retirement. And again, I think it gets at ecological, cultural, and political problems. Ecological on the ground, cultural within the agencies, and political within our elected officials. And that when you get at those problems, you expand what's possible. And so I loved that you said that, and just want the audience to know that this is one of Guardian's biggest priorities. And we got both Senator Heinrich and Ben Ray Lujan to introduce legislation last year that would allow for this. We're trying to get that across the finish line. Once we do, the goal is to replicate it in other states and get to work on transactions in the state of New Mexico. Shifting gears, because again, a lot more to cover here in just another 15 minutes. I want to talk about the federal fossil fuel program. And it's in an interesting place. And here's what I'll say. Good Friday, a month ago, President Biden made a not so good decision, lifting a moratorium that he had put in place. I remember the date, January 27th, 6 days into his administration, in an executive order. So he lifted a moratorium on the leasing of federal lands and waters. We sort of know why he did that at that time. When he did that, he proposed or directed the Interior Department to increase royalty rates. We talked about royalty rates in the context of, or alluded to them in the context of hard rock mining. Some conservationists, most definitely not Guardians, hailed that decision, kind of a fiscal prudence and what I would say is a climate recklessness. What's your assessment of both dimensions of that decision and how it reflects this new and old kind of visions for the lands in the context of the federal fossil fuel program?
Well, I must admit, and here you got to remember, I worked in the Carter administration in the Interior Department and the Clinton administration in the Interior Department. I worked on Capitol Hill for a while, so on public lands issues. So I have a sympathy with the dilemma, with the challenges that the Biden administration is facing here, and so they're in a very, very difficult place for reasons that are, I think, probably obvious to your audience. Biden does not control what happens on Capitol Hill, and we have a senator named Joe Manchin who is sort of in charge of energy policy, in effect, because of his being the 50th vote in an evenly divided Senate, so that's a problem. You also have a problem with some ambiguities in the law and some court decisions that have created a real kind of mess here in terms of what the executive power to say no more leasing is. We've had a couple of courts in Louisiana, for example, on suits by Republican state attorneys general, basically saying, you can't do this, you have to lease, and those decisions are on appeal. But there's kind of a legal tangle going on that is part of the problem. So, they're trying, I think the Biden administration is trying in good faith, as I see it, to sort of navigate this tortuous path through the transition away from fossil fuels. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that we have to do it. I think the Biden administration understands that we have to transition away from fossil fuels. And the question is, how soon and how fast can we do it politically? And that's a big challenge. Now, raising royalty rates is actually, that's a step in the right direction anyway, but it's not a magic bullet, because you can't raise royalty rates immediately for the leases that are already out there. That has to be done over years, actually. And then you can raise them for new leases, but those actually don't come into production for 5 or 10 years anyway. So that's not a magic bullet to the transition. It's a useful step to take, but but in itself is not really part of the solution. Now, I am rather optimistic because, for one thing, the market is speaking. Okay, let me give you 2 examples. One is President Trump issued oil and gas leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, put them up for sale. After a 40-year battle on a strict party line vote, Congress said in 2017, we're going to lease the Arctic Refuge. Trump, in one of his last acts, holds a big lease sale in the Arctic Refuge. It's supposed to raise billions of dollars in revenue for Alaska and for the federal treasury. They got a total of $14 million in bids, M. No major oil companies participated. The only real participant was an agency in the state of Alaska. So this big oil and gas lease sale was a bust. I mean, it was embarrassing, actually. Okay, fast forward 2 years. In March of this year, the Interior Department offers leases off of Long Island for wind energy. They got more than $4 billion with a B dollars in bids. So the transition is already happening. It's underway. From the big picture standpoint, the question is, how on oil and gas leasing do you navigate through as best you can? And like I said, as a kind of former insider, I have sympathy for the challenges and the difficulties they have politically.
Yeah, I want to say one thing about that, and then I want to let our audience know that we're going to get to questions, just because I'd like to ask some audience questions. But the one thing that I want to say is, I just think that it's spending political capital and reinforcing a bit of thinking from 15 years ago. And the world has changed. The climate realities are bearing down on us in ways that weren't apparent 15 years ago. And I both get it and strongly vehemently disagree with the idea that we want to generate more money from the fossil fuel industry. I'm going to go to a question. I know you'd love to respond, and we could talk about each of these things for much more time. This one is from Richard Spots, 15-year employee of the BLM, was probably with the BLM while throughout those Clinton years. I like this question. What can history teach us about the best methods for concerned citizens to pressure elected and appointed public officials to better protect supposedly protected public lands? And by that, I think he means, and Richard, you could elaborate in the chat box, but I know from Richard's perspective, like the Gold Butte National Monument, where the Bundys are grazing it to the bone, that's supposedly protected. It's not. And he says, I worked for BLM for 15 years and I know the sad reality. So the question is really about how we can pressure public officials and appointed officials to better protect supposedly protected public lands.
It's a key question, and there's no simple answer. But the short answer is engage. You have to engage and get more people engaged in the political process to persuade your elected officials, and that's everybody from your governor and congressman and everybody else to engage on these issues and press the federal land managers to do better. And part of it is can be done through kind of a popular, as you well know, thing in the last few years has been the formation of friends groups around particular areas of public lands. And they can be enormously effective. They're kind of in looking over the federal managers' shoulders on a daily basis. And that can be very effective. And then there's, of course, the historic tool of litigation. Although here I would caution, I think the litigation tool is not going to be as friendly or as useful as it was 20 years ago, because the courts are more conservative now than they were then. So I think all that underscores the importance of political engagement and just doing more of it at all levels, at all times. And again, I'm pretty optimistic. Now, the other thing to do, obviously, you have to have patience, and sometimes it takes a very long time. And Gold Butte and the Bundy cattle grazing is a good example of that. Because you're right, that is a problem that's been simmering a long time, and there's been basically relatively little action on it, or no action on it. And but in general, public engagement really does work over the long term to influence, I think, federal land managers.
It is the motto of countless activists. It's relentless pressure, relentlessly applied. And I think to that, I would add what you said, because I think it's patient persistence. I mean, patience in the context of relentless, sometimes it's like, why should we be patient? We should be impatient. But I agree with you that patience informs the longer view. So, couple more questions. Only got maybe a few more than 5 minutes. This one's from Murray Smart. What is being done to further investigate and expand wildlife corridors? This is a more modern question relative to that longer arc of interior engagement. Wildlife corridors and wildlife crossings are being expanded around the US and the world, seemingly with the support of many groups. Any thoughts on wildlife corridors and the role that the agencies can play or are playing?
Yeah, this is a very hopeful modern development, informed in part by better scientific understanding of migratory routes and that sort of thing. But it's beginning to take hold. I've been looking at this example in south of Yellowstone, the so-called Path of the Pronghorn. It's a migratory route. I think it's the longest route of a migratory animal. And there it's very interesting. The Forest Service actually on national forest land that this route goes along has actually protected it through its planning process. And the state of Wyoming is actually moving in that direction, but because of political problems is not joining hands with the Forest Service, but is kind of moving in the same direction through the state fish and game department. So I think these are things that are broadly supported, and I think we'll see a lot more of that. The infrastructure bill that passed Congress last year includes money for migratory bird crossings and or migratory animal crossings and that sort of thing. We're going to see a lot more structural accommodations, I think, for migration routes, funded by the feds and funded by states to some extent too. So I'm really hopeful. I think you'll see a lot of activity here all over the West where you have these migration routes. That's going to be a success story. I bet in 10 years, we're going to look back and say, wow, we did an awful lot.
Yep. You know, it's interesting, just one remark on that. Under Trump, one of the only things that the Interior Department did that I thought was good was actually, there was an executive order on corridors. So it does speak to, and you know, plenty of holes in that executive order, very little enforcement or implementation of that executive order. But nevertheless, a conservation vision that even the Trump administration chose to put some political will behind. So one more question. And then I've got a final question about the indigenous tribal perspective, which I think would be a good one to close on. This is from Chris Krupp. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, Mr. Leshy. Historically, which source of power has been more receptive to reform, Congress or the public land management agencies?
Excellent question. And one of the themes of my book, it goes along this line. The original impetus starting around 1890 for holding on to and protecting public lands and public ownership was largely Congress giving the executive branch broad authority to do that. That's how the National Forest System got created, et cetera. But in modern times, since about 1970, a little before 1970, Congress has been clawing back that authority that it had previously delegated to the agencies and made decisions itself to hold on to and protect these lands. And the classic example, and where it really started, was the WildEarth Act in 1964. Congress creates a new system of public land management, which applies across all agencies, not just Forest Service or Park Service. But Congress said not 1 acre goes in the wilderness system unless we, the Congress, approve it. So it takes an act of Congress to put land in the wilderness system. Now, and so this is Congress making the decision, not the executive branch. The great irony here is that the proponent of that was a conservative Westerner named Wayne Aspinall, congressman from Colorado. He insisted on that Congress be the gatekeeper because he thought Congress wouldn't designate very much land as wilderness. He didn't like the idea of wilderness, but he said, I'll go along with it as long as Congress makes the decision. Well, he badly misread what was going to happen because environmental advocates, wilderness advocates went out and organized the grassroots. And they persuaded Congress eventually to put more than 100 million acres by individual statutes, put more than 100 million acres into wilderness. That was a legislative decision. And it showed the power of the grassroots activists. It also was thoroughly bipartisan. Ronald Reagan signed more bills putting more acres in wilderness than any president before or after him, with the exception of Jimmy Carter because of the big Alaska bill. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this is the modern story. Congress comes along and wants to create national recreation areas, national wild and scenic rivers, national conservation areas. Those are all done by acts of Congress, basically. So this idea of Congress making the decision is a very modern trend and continues today. And that's why this is a political success story. This is the power of groups like yours going out and organizing the grassroots to get this kind of thing done. And that's, again, why I'm optimistic about more of this happening in the future.
Yeah. So just so I'm clear, I think the answer is Congress, unquestionably, right? Not the agencies.
in modern times, it's more the Congress than the agency, although they obviously work together a fair amount, and the agencies still exercise leadership in some areas. I don't mean it's all one or the other, but on balance, Congress is being much more active in modern times, and the executive branch agencies were more in leadership positions in the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add to it by saying I think the agencies have not only been captive to the extractive industries, and actually a law professor at the University of Wyoming spoke to this, Deb Donahue, about how the agencies are captive to, in this case, in that particular case, the livestock industry. But not only are they captive, I also think they're insular. They're not, Congress is an elected body. They're accountable to the voters, and the agencies aren't. And so they have some of the worst qualities of bureaucracies, including being insular to what the public thinks. So just closing thoughts around this issue of the role and the significance of tribes and pueblos. Obviously, you spoke to the deeper history and the complexities there. Today, we see rising tribal co-management of public lands. You see also a land back movement in which people want lands of all kinds to be returned to tribes. Could you just speak to, in a minute, laughing at that request, briefly, how you think what the challenges and opportunities are of the role of tribes in kind of at this nexus of public lands, conservation, and the biodiversity and climate crises? Like, how are the role of tribes different today, looking to the future, than they were in the past?
Yeah. As I said, my book doesn't deal with the dispossession, but I do have a long, pretty detailed chapter toward the end of my book about the modern resurgence of tribes and native nations wanting to exercise more influence over public lands to which they have ancestral ties. And that's a pretty big modern movement happening in a lot of different places, and has had some real successes that I document in this chapter. And that will obviously continue. And the successes, by successes, I mean all kinds of things, like specific protection for cultural resources found on public lands, special protected access for hunting and gathering rights and that sort of thing that may or may not be protected by treaty. That involves something like co-management. Now, you have to be a little careful when you talk about co-management, because there's no legal definition of the term. There's no agreement on what exactly co-management means. But the basic idea is that tribes should have special influence over how public lands to which they have ancestral ties are managed. And that's happening in all kinds of places by various different means. There's no one size fits all kind of formula here. But without question, tribes are exercising more influence. And then in some cases, relatively rare, but it does happen, tribes are getting land back. I mean, the Congress is making a decision to restore lands to tribes. And that happens in it's very much a kind of a negotiated situation. These are political lands. The political process governs what's going to happen to them. So in order for that to happen, Congress has to pass a law. And in specific circumstances, Congress has done that when it's been satisfied that there is really a compelling case for the tribes to actually get title. But usually there's something less than that. And the example that I was deeply involved in myself is the Pueblo of Sandia outside of Albuquerque. Worked out a deal with the Forest Service. They had been really wrongfully deprived of land by a surveying error, and they worked out a deal with the Forest Service where they managed this particular area that they'd been deprived of. So both the Forest Service and the tribe have a kind of a veto over what happens in that area, and we'll see more things like that as well. So I think this is by and large a positive move. And if you look at sort of protection advocates, wilderness advocates on the one hand, and tribal interests on the other, they align the vast, vast majority of the time. Not necessarily 100%. They're not always going to agree on everything. But, you know, the native nations are a big ally of the protection advocates in most situations. And it's very important that they work and get along together, because together they're much more powerful than they are separate. So I think this is another place where I'm pretty optimistic that we'll see more good constructive solutions.
Yep. Well, I can say through the Guardians lens that it is an area where we are working more and more with tribes, whether around the protection of Greater Chaco or in the Greater Gila landscape. And some of it is through the lens of just a desire for thinking about issues of equity and justice in ways that frankly weren't quite as prevalent when I first stepped into this movement 30 years ago. And so there's a reckoning of our broader history and a desire to do right. And so it's a complex landscape, and one that we all need to navigate in service of protecting more land and also reckoning with that deeper history. So I appreciate your reflections on that. Thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I would love to do it again, because there are lots of things that we didn't go into as deeply as I would have liked, and even a bunch of subjects that we didn't even get to cover, which speaks to the breadth and depth of the history and the diversity and complexity of our lands and all the issues surrounding them. So thank you again. I didn't say this, but Kevin did in the chat box. Would love for the audience to pick up John's book. Would love you all also to connect with there it is, folks.
There it is.
Connect with our website and our action center so that you can defend these lands and the laws that support them. And let's do it again, John, and we'll be doing other WildEarth webinars on other subjects, including Greater Chaco in the next few weeks. So look for that on our website and in our email. So thank you again, John.
Okay, thank you, John, and keep up the good work, you guys. And delighted to be here, and I'll come back anytime.
Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Good night.